Okay, so I have all my pieces cut out, my 6 shapes for my 3 basic solder joints. I have 2 pieces for my perpendicular. I have 2 pieces cut for my butt joint, and I have 2 pieces cut for my sweat joint. So the next step in preparing these pieces for soldering is to file my edges. I want to clean up any bumpy curves, make them nice and smooth. I want to straighten any edges that are supposed to be straight and make them straight if I need to. And while I'm doing that, I'll be test fitting my pieces to make sure that there's no space or no gaps between the edges or between the pieces. So I also need to make sure that the pieces are flat, but I'll do that after filing, and I'll explain flattening after filing. So what I need for filing is I have my number 2 cut half round file, my jeweler's file. This is not a file that you get from a hardware store. You must get this from a jewelry supplier. These are a little expensive, but they will last a lifetime. I'm still using files that I bought 30 years ago. So they're worth the money. And we're using the half round file because it's versatile. One side of the file is flat, good for filing straight edges or outward curves. And then the other side is half round, and that's good for filing inward curves. Now sometimes you'll have curves that are too small or corners that are too small to get your half round file into. In that instance, you'll want to use a needle file. And these come in a variety of shapes and cuts also, and they'll fit into any small area that you need to file. And I have some tight curves on this one piece, so I probably will need to use a needle file in that area. Another really handy tool is called a ring clamp, and this is good for holding small parts. So if I need to file this really small piece of metal, I can put it, it's easier to put it in the ring clamp, put it in the end. Oh, sorry. All right, let me just grab a piece of metal for an example. Put it in the end, hold it tight, put the wedge in the other end, get a little smack on your bench, and that will hold this nice and tight while you're filing. It's a little easier than holding it with your hand. Small pieces. Larger pieces, not a problem. All right, so when you're filing, I didn't flip my bench pin. I think I mentioned that this type of pin has an angled side for filing and emerying. So I'll flip that over. And I'll start with a straight edge. This is easier. Now I can either hold this and file with the edge hanging over the edge of the bench pin like so, or because I have these little slots in my bench pin, I can hold it upright and file this way. And when you're filing, you always want to hold the point of the file should be facing your bench pin or your bench. The tang of the file should be facing you. When you file, you want to make sure that you file one stroke at a time in a forward motion. You don't want to file back and forth, because if you pull the file backward, then you're just clogging the teeth with metal dust or metal flakes. So one stroke at a time in a forward motion, like so. You want to make sure that you don't angle the file this way or this way. You'll have a beveled edge. That's fine if you want a beveled edge, but in this case, I am filing for a butt joint. So this edge has to be perfectly straight, perfectly flat. So one stroke at a time, like so. And if I was using the bench pin, the side of the bench pin, I would file this way. I find this upright position to be a little more comfortable. That's for me. As I'm filing, I will also be test fitting. So I have my two pieces prepared, and what I'm looking for, oops, is no space, no gap. They must fit together perfectly. I'm also looking to see if they're flat. They look pretty flat. So I think these two pieces are actually, they're ready to go. They're ready for the next step, which would be emerying. Now I mentioned the needle files for these tight curves, and actually this ring clamp might be useful for this. This would be a little difficult to hold off the bench pin. So maybe I want to try the ring clamp for this. Put in that wedge, give it a smack, and then I can support the ring clamp in the V slot on my bench pin. Alright, so I think I need a half round needle file. And here's one. This should be perfect for getting into these inward curves. And again, one stroke at a time in a forward motion. Just going to clean those up, make them nice and smooth. Make sure they're not bumpy or lumpy. And for really tight, these are really small. I might want to use a round file in there, but I didn't bring any over for the video, but we do have smaller files, smaller than the needle files. They're called escapement files. So this round file will fit in here okay, but for really small areas, I would want to use these escapement files. Okay, filing, be careful with it. You don't want to overfile, you don't want to underfile. And something that you can do, let me see if I have a piece of metal that isn't filed, because I like to usually use this as an example. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the video. This edge is not filed. It looks kind of dull. As you're filing, your edges will get a little shiny. Let me see if this will do it. What you can see, if you have the right light, I don't really have the right light here, and this might not be too uneven, but if your edge is uneven, you'll see light spots and dark spots on your edge. The dark spots would be edges that haven't been hit with the file yet, which means you need to continue filing. I think this one's pretty even, so I don't really have those dark spots that I'm talking about. But you can also run your finger over the edge and feel how smooth or not smooth it is. So if you feel lumps and bumps, you know you have to continue filing. If it's nice and smooth, maybe you're done. Another thing you might want to do if you have a piece that has sharp corners, you might want to round those off a little bit. If your piece is going to be something wearable, and I'm not saying you have to make them real round, but you don't want them too sharp and too pointy on a wearable piece. You may hurt the wearer. So you might just want to round them off a little bit so they're not painful. Okay, when you're done filing, the next step is to make sure that these pieces are flat. All right, so for the butt joint, these two pieces, the solder joint has to fit perfectly. No space, no gap. The two pieces have to be completely flat. And they look pretty good. For the perpendicular, the bottom edge of the top piece needs to be perfectly straight or perfectly flat. The bottom piece needs to be flat, and this is going to sit on top of there with no space or gap between the two. I might see a little bit of a space between those. I might need to file this top piece a little more. Probably do. But that bottom piece looks relatively flat, so I'm in pretty good shape there. I'll file that just a little more. Now for the sweat joint, both pieces have to be perfectly flat. So you'll file these edges to clean them up, true them up, and then make sure that when you put the top piece on the bottom piece, you don't see any space or gap between the two. That looks pretty good. I think this is just a little, has a little bit of a bow to it. I might want to try to remove that. Now to remove that, I'll need mallets. I like these urethane mallets. Typically jewelers use rawhide mallets, and I've never liked them. And then I came across these Cook hammers, urethane mallets. I love these. They just leave no marks on the metal. They hold up a very long time. They're lovely. And you'll need a steel block, and I have paper on mine because my block is very old and has a lot of nicks and dents in it. Those will transfer to my metal. So when I'm flattening my metal, I like to cover the block with paper. I can even recycle old magazine pages for this too. So when I flatten my metal, let me explain one thing too. Your metal is in a very hardened state when you purchase it because of the way it's fabricated. So sometimes when you're trying to flatten hard metal, it will not flatten. It'll just spring back to however it was. So we can soften the metal by heating it with a torch. And I'll explain, it's called annealing, and I'll explain annealing in a separate video. But right now I just want to try to flatten this in its hardened state. If it won't flatten, then I will anneal it, and that will soften the metal, and then I should be able to flatten it with no problem. So I'll explain annealing when we start soldering, because I'll do that first and then we'll solder. So to flatten, I just basically, I always hold down the opposite end and then flip it, and that end, and then flip it over. And you don't have to slam this really hard. I mean, you be fairly gentle, especially after you anneal it and the metal is soft. So I forget where that bow was, but if I move this around, I think it actually looks pretty good now. So I won't have to anneal these pieces. They're ready to go. So the next step in preparing these pieces for soldering is to emery them. And I like to use wet and dry emery because I can use it with water, and you can actually put a little bit of Dawn dish liquid in the water along with not along with anything, just a little bit of Dawn dish liquid. It helps the emery, dip the emery in, helps the emery to slide over the metal a little faster, a little smoother. Now you have to make a judgment call when you start emerying. You have to look at your pieces of metal and say, wow, do I have a lot of scratches, deep scratches in the metal? And this one, yeah, I could have some deep scratches in here. You also might want to cover your bench pin at this point, because when you emery one side first, you're going to have metal dust on the bench pin. Then when you flip it over to emery the other side, the metal dust on your bench pin might scratch the side you've already emeryed. Now, emerying is a slow process. It's time consuming and it's mindless work, so it does get a little boring. But take your time with it. This is a really important part of preparing these pieces. So you want to be very neat with your emerying. And you do not have to press really hard into the metal. You are putting scratches on the surface, so you want to have a very light touch. And I'm starting with 400, then I'll drop down to, actually, no, I'm starting with, this is 320. I'm starting with 320, then I'll drop down to 400, and then I'll go to 600. So 400 is finer than 320, 600 is finer than 400. So with each course of emerying, my emery strokes will get finer and finer until I have a nice, smooth, evenly emeried surface. So I'm going to start just by going over. Actually, I think I'll just do a portion of this so you can see the difference between the unemeryed metal and metal that has been hit with the 320. I'm barely putting any pressure on the emery. Very light touch. And I don't know if you can see this. Let me see. I'm getting a glare from the window. What you'll see, similar to filing, you'll see light spots and dark spots. So right over here on this edge, I see some dark spots. Those have not been hit by the emery yet. So this surface is a little uneven. So I'm looking for it to be very even. So I'm overlapping my strokes, very light touch, until I see a nice even finish on the surface. When I have that, then I know I'm ready to go to the next finer grit of emery. I'm still seeing those dark spots on the edge. Okay, this video could go on forever, so I'm not going to make you wait until I have this completely done. The dark spots are almost gone, not quite, but let's see if I can get this up without too much glare. Nope, a lot of glare. Okay, this has a fairly even coating of emery marks except for those dark spots. A little bit of scratch still there in the middle. But just to show you, you can now, I can go to the next grit, 400, and do the same thing. Just light touch and overlap your strokes. And when you have a nice even finish from the 400, you can go to the 600. And that should give you a good enough finish. So if you do this preparation work, and you're really good at it, you do a good prep, and you're neat with it, and then you're neat with your soldering, you have less cleanup to do after soldering. It's almost like house painting. If you do really neat spackling and clean up the cracks and nicks and dents in your wall, you do a good job of prepping, then you'll have a really good paint job. Okay, so that's basic emerying. A couple of emerying tricks you can do. You can always wrap emery around a file if you need to. You can tape a piece of emery down to a flat surface with masking tape. So if I need to just clean up this edge a little bit, I can, if I tape this down to my bench or a board, I can, sorry, my arm is in the way. I have to do this with my other hand. I can then rub this over the emery. I don't want to do it untaped because the emery will curl up. But I could then just run this edge on the emery and straighten that edge out a little more. Another trick is you can wrap emery, around sticks. Some people use paint sticks. I don't like the paint sticks. They're too flexible. But when you need to emery, a large surface, this can come in really handy, especially if the surface is formed. I don't have a formed surface right here with me. So but if I want to run across a surface, a large area, the sticks come in real handy. So I'm using a piece of lattice rather than a paint stick, because like I said, the paint sticks are flexible. They tend to bend a lot as you're emerying. So I can cover a large surface with this fairly easy. Excuse me. So to do that, what I've done is I started by laying the lattice on the emery, and I scored it ever so slightly with my knife, folded it over, put a piece of masking tape there, score again using the lattice as a guide, fold it over. Really can't see what I'm doing, can you? Okay, score again, fold it over, score again, fold it over, and so on and so on. I've already done all the scoring. The scoring has to be very light. It's just so that you can bend this easier. If you go too heavy with the scoring, you'll cut through the emery. Okay, so once you have filed, flattened, anneal if you need to flatten, and then emery. Your joints are fitting properly, there's no space, no gaps. You are ready for soldering. All right, next time, soldering.